Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
Good afternoon, Team Krulak community, and on behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Brute Krulak Center for Innovation and Creativity, welcome back to the Brutecast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the U.S. government. All right, so today we have a return guest to the Brutecast, and if you joined us last summer for our Wargaming panel, you've seen some of his work. Dr. Andrew Reddie is an assistant professor of practice at the University of California, Berkeley School of Information, and senior engineer at Sandia National Laboratories, where he works on projects related to cybersecurity, nuclear weapons policy, wargaming, and emerging military technologies. Andrew is currently a Bridging the Gap New Era Fellow, Hans J. Morgenthau Fellow at Notre Dame University, a non-resident fellow here at the Krulak Center, and research director at the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. His work has appeared in Science, the Journal of Cyber Policy, and the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, among other outlets, and has been variously supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, MacArthur Foundation, and the U.S. Department of Energy's Nuclear Science and Security Consortium. So on our Wargaming panel, you got a taste of his work. Today, we're going to do a deep dive in his discussion on From Art to Science, Analytical Wargaming, and Behavioral Research. Dr. Reddie, thanks for joining us, and I'll turn things over to you.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Ian. Very, very kind introduction, and looking forward to chatting with the group here shortly. So with that, I'll get started and share my screen. Of course, as Ian mentioned, the usual caveats apply. I'm speaking here in a personal capacity. The views presented here don't reflect those of U.S. government, the national labs, or indeed Sandia National Labs. So hopefully you can see here full screen. So I'm going to talk to you today about, my presentation today is built on a paper that's been recently submitted, kind of really getting focused on wargame design and how we might be thinking about the laboratory effects that are kind of embedded inside of the wargame designs that we use, and kind of leaving us all with a question at the end as to how best to start to tease out the laboratory effects associated with various types of wargames. In terms of motivating this, a lot of the work that we did in the nuclear wargaming realm with our platform Signal, which was one of the first large scale experimental wargaming platforms kind of created towards data collection, we actually implemented it in kind of three different modes. We implemented it as a tabletop exercise, kind of seminar-based game. We implemented it as a board game with obviously rules-based adjudication, no white cell, if you will. And then, of course, in an online game. And I think one of the things that came out of that process was recognizing the differences in player behavior across those different environments, not necessarily in the ways that you would expect. So, for example, one of the things that we were often told when we were starting the project was that players who played the online game were sure to be aggressive because I'm putting them behind a computer screen, and when humans are faced with a computer screen, they become very aggressive. Well, we didn't find that inside of our data, so that's an interesting finding. But it is the case that the behaviors between the board and the tabletop exercise and the online game look very different. And in an environment where all of us are trying to figure out, what wargaming looks like during COVID, and turning towards the use of online tools for doing things like we do in our work with large N data analysis, thinking really seriously about, how to appropriately kind of think and tease apart these effects is really important. So what I want to do today is to kind of talk a little bit about what I see as our challenge as a wargaming community when we're talking about wargame design, talk a little bit about where wargaming methods fit inside of the broader analytical toolkit, and then present the wargame designer's trilemma, which is kind of reflecting how we think about wargame design inside of our shop, and then talk through a couple of examples from from existing work, and then finally talk about where we think analytical wargaming, could go here moving forward. I think that one of the things that hopefully was made clear in the wargaming panel last year is that this is a really exciting part of the field for lots of important reasons, not least that the ways in which we would kind of usually engage with questions around international security often don't apply to the questions that we seem to be getting asked by policymakers. Questions like, how do emerging capabilities impact strategic stability? We don't have empirical data with which to actually adjudicate that question. And so, wargaming offers something of a compelling tool inside of our toolkit to actually engage with those sorts of questions and actually give, some answers that are grounded in terms of analytical insight rather than just, theorizing around the problem set. So that's what we'll do here, hopefully for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll go to Q&A, and really interested to have that chat with all of you. So as I mentioned, a lot of the questions that we're getting asked in this kind of early 2020s time period suffer from this problem, which is a dearth of empirical data. In an ideal case, as a social scientist, if I'm presented with a problem, I will go out into the world and I'll try to find examples of that problem and then look for insights based on that empirical data. But if somebody asks me, hey, what's the impact of hypersonic glide on the likelihood of escalation? Or, does missile defense capability lead to more proliferation of certain capabilities? I'm not in a place where I can adjudicate those claims on the basis of empirical data. So anytime that we're faced with new capabilities or new strategies, what we find is a big theoretical discussion in our, in our venues du jour, whether it's War on the Rocks or the Bulletin or Lawfare, kind of talking about the relative costs and benefits of deploying a certain capability or not. And that literature is great. I mean, lots of really smart people are involved in it, but it can be fairly unsatisfying based on the fact that there's no real data to kind of get to grips with and to try to adjudicate, who's right and who's wrong. And I think one of the pitches that, I often make is that wargaming methods can really fill this gap and provide a really powerful tool with which to think about strategic interaction and having consequences that matter, and getting a sense of how humans behave in these environments where the capabilities are present, and looking at how that might vary in those situations where they don't. And so I think that this is why I get up in the morning. This is why I'm excited about this particular tool. And so, as I mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about the challenge posed for designing war games for analytical purposes, examine some of the value associated with analytical wargaming approaches. I'll do a little bit of compare and contrast with formal methods, survey experiments, etc., and talk about what I think are some of the important differences between them, and then interrogate some examples of wargaming used for analytical purposes. And the goal here is to really start a conversation in the community about how various game designs influence what we can learn from war games, and to make sure that we're not overstating what we can learn from war games, but also not understating, and kind of being clear as we walk into a particular problem set. This is what a war game design can actually achieve here. And as I said, this presentation is very much based on an article that we've written for our colleagues at the Naval War College for a leading and edited volume on cyber wargaming. So as I mentioned, our past work was really focused on the nuclear set. And so I'll foreshadow some of the research that you're going to see coming out of our shop on cyber deterrence, just in case it's of interest to folks. So the toolkit. As I mentioned, as a social scientist, modally, I will go out into the world and I'll look for empirical or observational data. And, that work will take the form of case study research, using, methods of agreement, methods of difference, or, large N data collection efforts. So things like the International Crisis Behavior data set, or the correlates of war, or MIDS, right? Those are going to be used to kind of engage with, particular sets of questions. And those are great as far as they go, but only when that data is available. And as I've said, a lot of the questions that I think are most interesting currently in the field don't have this empirical data present. And so, that leaves us looking at various synthetic data sharing processes, or what I call DGPs, that are well worn. So, for a lot of problems where we don't have empirical data, we rely on game theory and formal models, and we say, okay, well, this problem, it looks a little bit like chicken, or it looks a little bit like the prisoner's dilemma, and so that's kind of how I'm going to think through this problem set. And that's been useful as far as it goes. Computer-based simulation and modeling, the same. Obviously, with those tools, you're able to expand the number of variables inside of the analysis, and also get to run the models over and over again, which is useful. But one of the things that is problematic for both formal models and computer-based simulation and modeling is that it really relies upon assumptions about how the world works in order to drive model outcomes rather than human behavior. There's no human inside of my computer-based model that says, hey, I'm going to do this. Instead, I'm saying, hey, a human has these characteristics. Let's say, well, they're more or less rational, and they more or less have good information about what's going on. Therefore, this is how they're likely to behave as the model spits out an answer. So to remedy that particular problem, the fact that we kind of take the human out of the process, we often turn towards things like survey experiments. And so these are great. Like, they have humans inside of them. They have other problems, not least that I give you a survey for 5 to 10 minutes. There's no real consequences for you bubbling in A, B, or C. And of course, you don't have a lot of time to think about how those consequences might be internalized in any case. There's various ways where we try to get around this problem instead of survey experiments, but it's pretty intrinsic to the method. And so one of the things that I quite like about wargames used for analytical purposes, and particularly when they're used in experimental forms, is that we can address these issues, because wargames provide an environment where humans are central to gameplay, and we also have players having to engage with the consequences of their actions from round to round. And so they deal with some of the problems that are associated with other synthetic DGPs. Of course, this is not me standing on my bully pulpit and saying, we should do only wargaming all the time. All of these data generating processes have their time and place, and I'm a big fan of mixed methods work. So oftentimes in the work that you'll see from me, you'll see a combination of wargaming data with survey data, with formal modeling data, and where it's available empirical data as well. And so you definitely want to try to kind of triangulate findings across DGPs if it's possible. But I think it is worth pointing out where these differences lie. And of course, Signal, the nuclear war game that we built between Berkeley, Livermore, and Sandia, serves as a really good example of this, right? It was a game that was built towards trying to get large numbers of players to play a large number of games, and then using those games to actually establish how differences in capabilities influence gameplay. And obviously, we were most interested in patterns of nuclear use inside of that context. But very excited about how that turned out. To the best of our knowledge, it's still the largest wargaming data set of its kind that exists. And of course, the wargaming also gets to build on a lot of history that going all the way back from German examples into Naval War College examples into the various applications during the Cold War. On both the training and education side, where we see war games used in both military and academic contexts. Indeed, I just ran here from a class where definitely use war games inside the classroom, and they work really well. Trust me, it's easier to teach deterrence from a war game than having them having undergraduates read shelling, although shelling's great. And then obviously the analytical applications. And I think that one of the things that is true of existing analytical work is that they look slightly different from the way that our team's kind of gone about using war games for analysis. So often, shops like CNA and RAND, Naval War College, laterally CNAS, they often design games specifically around an identified policy challenge. So you'll see a Baltic Sea game, a South China Sea game, a Taiwan Straits crisis game, etc. Obviously not always tied to geography, but geography is obviously one of the variables that often we look at. They also often have large game staffs and in-depth preparation for the games. I've seen briefing books that are novel length that are given to players before they step inside of the room. And often we're trying to engage high-level policymakers inside of these environments. Whether they're current officials, that's sometimes very difficult to achieve. Former officials, a little bit easier. Think tankers, senior academics, etc. And so, this is kind of the way that traditionally we've thought about using or designing war games with analytical applications. But those traditional wargame designs have problems, not least replication. So oftentimes a game design, particularly if it's white cell oriented, will have a game that moves in a particular direction, and it's very difficult to unpack how it ends up moving in that direction and what role the white cell plays in driving that process forward. There's also sample bias concerns, particularly when you don't get current officials but get formers. And obviously, if you don't get the right mix of players, for example, if you're really interested in a China scenario or a Russia scenario, having an American Chinese expert is not the same thing as having a Chinese policymaker. And so that's a pretty significant problem associated with the ways that we kind of traditionally do these war games. And then, of course, laterally, sponsorship bias. We need to make sure that war games aren't used to kind of rehash debates that have already been settled. And so, I think most of the shops that I mentioned are really good about this. But there is, of course, a danger that, a question's been asked and answered and a war game is used to kind of buttress an argument. And of course, when you're thinking about pure research, that's not what we're after. We also have data concerns with these war games. Indeed, the data that you derive from a lot of traditional war games is really rapporteur based. And so what the rapporteurs are able to capture is ends up being the conclusion. And obviously, we can talk about, who those rapporteurs tend to be, et cetera. As a result, data collection can be a little bit incidental. There can be a little bit of confusion about whether the war game is interested in what I call process-oriented conclusions versus outcome-oriented conclusions. It's perfectly reasonable from my perspective for a traditional war game design to say, hey, I've got a lot of current or former officials around the table, and they seem to think that issue X is germane to this crisis. That's a perfectly reasonable finding from a war game that's played once. What I think is a little bit more tenuous is if an analyst says, well, in the Baltic Sea scenario that we played, this happened. And on the basis of that one game, you say, hey, this is going to happen every single time inside this scenario. That's not super appropriate from my perspective. The other major problem with game design that we have currently is that game designs are treated as intellectual property, which means that actually interrogating them for things like laboratory effects that I want to talk about here shortly is very difficult to do. Ideally, we want researchers to pick up game designs and try them in lots of different ways. I want somebody to pick up the signal game design and I want them to change something about it. So we built a 3-player game. What happens if you have exactly the same rule set and you play it with 5 players? Does it meaningfully change the conclusions that we're able to draw about gameplay? That's the way we want this kind of community to work. And when we treat war game designs as intellectual property, that becomes very difficult to do. So one of the things that we've committed to do in our work is to publish the game designs and actually publish articles that discuss the game design decisions that we make, because of course there are no quote unquote right decisions in war game design. There are just defensible decisions in war game design. So we'll publish articles about the results of a particular war game environment vis-a-vis a research question, but also publish an article that talks about the design trade-offs that we've made as well. And I think that's really important to do, particularly as we're only at the very beginning of understanding these laboratory effects. And so I think that's a really important thing to emphasize. And so experimental wargaming methods or analytical wargaming methods should seek to address these challenges. Try to create conditions under which causal inference is possible, generalizability of findings is possible, replicability is possible, and provide a way to do theory development and theory testing where observational data, is otherwise limited. And obviously, one of the nice things that you get in war games that you don't get in formal models and you don't get in survey experiments is that you can layer on the complexity in ways that perhaps you can't inside of those DGPs. That's not to say that we can make wargame designs endlessly complex. You absolutely can't, for reasons that I'll discuss here shortly. But you are able to kind of talk about cyber and conventional and gray zone and nuclear in the same breath without kind of having to separate all of them out like I would in a survey experiment. And so, that's pretty useful as well. And of course, I have lots of colleagues writing around this area. It's not just me. Jackie Schneider's doing lots of great work here. Eric Lynn Greenberg's doing great work here. Reed Pauly, more recently, John Emery, diving into archival wargame data from RAND and from MIT, are doing excellent work in this space. And so, I want to talk a little bit about wargame design, just to kind of open up the box, if you will, the black box of game design, to kind of give you a sense of what we think about when we're doing designing. And indeed, our team has come up with this, what we think is a kind of a trilemma between the different things that you weigh as a wargame designer. And so, I'm going to talk about them here. To start with, I'll say that there is no, again, right or textbook level of fidelity or complexity or abstraction that you can bake into any particular game. It's where you land inside of this triangle is always going to be driven by your research question, and I think that's appropriate. And so, really, what we weigh within our team are three things. The first is analytical utility. Am I able to answer my research question and extract the data that I need from the wargame to answer my research question? Right. So analytical utility is up there. Engaging play. Right. Is a player able to actually pick up my game and learn it in a reasonable amount of time that allows them to play it and for me to collect data on them? And hopefully it's not sterile, right? Don't create a sterile environment for your player. And then finally, contextual realism. Does it take the things that are happening in the real world that we want to model and creating them inside the game environment appropriately? And obviously, different games look different based on where we live inside of this triangle. For example, Signal, designed certainly with analytical utility in mind, abstracts out a lot of contextual realism in terms of capabilities. We're not modeling lots of nuclear effects. We're only modeling some of them. Engaging play, we have some variation in players who think the Signal was really easy versus really hard. But again, you want to try to create like the Goldilocks amount of engagement from your game design. And so where we end up living inside of this triangle is really important. So that's important to note up front. Indeed, you can actually put the DGPs that I just mentioned previously on this same triangle if you'd like, or simplex if you prefer that language. So obviously, simulation and modeling tools, right? They push towards analytical utility and far away from contextual realism, and they don't care at all about engaging play. Right? They're not games, so that makes sense. Empirical approaches, that's real world data. Of course, that's contextual realism. It's messy data. We often have to process it, right, to make it analytically tenable. So that's more on the contextual realism side. Traditional war games are far more towards engaging play, probably also towards contextual realism. But like I said, we have this big problem about doing outcome-oriented causal inference from that traditional wargaming data. Survey experiments, right, more towards analytical utility, not super engaging, right? It's a piece of paper that I give you. Hopefully the scenario is interesting. And then obviously you leave out a lot of complexity in order to get it down to a paragraph vignette on a page. And of course, I'm creating these kind of ideal typical examples of each of these DGPs. I understand that there's variation on these axes, but this is generally kind of our sense of where those DGPs live in this simplex. And then of course, I'm going to make the pitch that war games thought about experimentally, thought about analytically, can be a really useful way to kind of square the triangle, if you will. It can provide the best bits of all three of these things, and then we kind of move around based on the different things that we're interested in this space. So yeah, like I said, useful method to square the triangle, but we do have existing war games that look different. They come in different shapes and sizes, and so I'm going to talk through three fairly well-known examples and kind of talk through our kind of examination of them and where they might fall inside of the simplex. And so I'll look at Jackie Schneider, Rachel Schaefer and Ben Schechter's International Crisis Wargame, Ben Jensen and David Banks' Island Intercept, and Ben Jensen and Brendan Valeriano's Cyber Escalation Exercise, and talk through them in brief. Obviously, in the paper, we go into far more detail. But certainly, ICWG designed very much with analytical utility in mind. Doesn't use real-world nations and geographies for lots of good reasons. That level of realism can often make results more complicated. It's also a one-sided game design, so it's players versus scenario, and adversary behavior is predetermined and prescribed by the scenario. So inside of this particular game design, your actions inside of the game don't actually influence his gameplay in the next round. And so obviously that's a choice that's taken with analytical utility in mind, but it has consequences for engaging play, certainly, and arguably also for contextual realism. As opposed to that particular example, Island Intercept, right, it really closely approximates contextual realism, right? They're really interested in a real world scenario, specifically the South China Sea, and they prescribe who their players are and imbue them with the characteristics of those real world players. It allows for strategic interaction between two players, and there are consequences associated with their gameplay from round to round. Of course, this leads to the potential for players to caricature what they think Washington would do or what they think Beijing would do, rather than engaging with the strategic dilemmas that are inherent within the gameplay, right? Like you have win conditions inside of the game that your players should be servicing. You might be worried that they're not servicing because they would say something like, well, Beijing would never do that, they would do this. Washington would never do this, they would do that, and what have you. And then, of course, the characteristics that they build into their cyber cards, which is how they model cyber capabilities, are abstracted, necessarily so. Obviously can't put the full suite of cyber capabilities inside of a war game. You're going to have to make choices about how those get presented to people, generally based on who gets to play the game and what level of expertise they might have. It's important to note one of the things I really like about their design was that it was mixed methods from the beginning. And so they actually have a survey experiment that goes alongside the war game that deals with some of the challenges that I noted up front. And then we have the cyber escalation exercise from Brandon and Ben. So again, here we have the primary emphasis on analytical utility. There's no strategic interaction between players to drive engagement, and players don't see the consequences of their decisions. So again, you're making choices with the ability to kind of pull data out, and that has a lot of consequences for engaging play. The designers do try to use real world documents inside of the gameplay to say like, hey, this is something that you would get in the real world, and so take a lot of care to have those national security documents look realistic and lend themselves towards contextual realism. Like ICWG, the game ends after one round with teams briefing out their collective decisions to a broader group, right? So again, overall, you're maximizing analytical utility, moving away from engaging play, and being somewhere in the middle on the contextual realism side. All this to demonstrate, and again, this isn't a discussion of like what's good versus what's bad, just that we have these designs, and granted, we have relatively few of them in the open domain. We have these designs and they look different, and the researchers have made choices, and those choices may or may not matter. We don't have the basis with which to actually adjudicate whether those choices have mattered or not, because we don't have the canon of war games and the data to really pull them all apart and adjudicate them. Okay, so we see significant variation, and so we need, I think, in my estimation, tools to further interrogate how these designs influence the data that you're getting out of wargame environments. And then, of course, those findings should provide normative recommendations to wargame designers as to where inside of the simplex we ought to be living for different sets of research questions, different sets of players, and different sets of problems. So, like I said, that's really the thrust of this presentation. That's my pitch. We really need to be taking these laboratory effects seriously, particularly as we look at the suite of phenomena that war games are particularly useful and relevant to look at. So crisis decision making, We don't have lots of good data there, although there are a few efforts to get better empirics there. Gray zone operations, same story. Cyber warfare, same story. Nascent military capabilities, hypersonics, missile defense, right? No empirical data there. And then, of course, new strategies and doctrine. How are they likely to affect conflict escalation dynamics, streak stability, and what have you? So in terms of what we're up to, just in case it's useful to discuss in Q&A, we asked in our past work, under what conditions do nuclear capabilities affect the likelihood of nuclear use? In our current project that's underway now, under the Pegasus brand at Sandia, the game itself is called Tantalus, and part of a platform that we're hoping to build for the field called Castle to hopefully make wargame designs and build easier. We're asking, is cyber deterrence possible? And pushing on the use of cyber threats and kind of looking at when or under what conditions players might decide to use cyber threats to try to influence adversary behavior or not. And looking at the prevalence of those cyber threats versus conventional threats. And then also looking at the behaviors that players are attempting to deter with cyber threats as well. So we're looking at, are players more likely to make deterrent threats of various types, under what conditions, etc. And one of the kind of theoretical principles that we're kind of testing is something that we describe as the communication capability trade-off. So one of the things that has led some scholars to suggest makes the use of cyber threats untenable for achieving deterrence is that by virtue of actually communicating my cyber threat, I might be giving up the ghost in terms of what my capability is doing. So that might allow my adversary to either defend against it or to use that same vulnerability against me. And in both cases, in either driver, you'd be less likely to make that deterrent threat in the first place, given those concerns. And so what we do instead of our Tantalus design is vary the domains of the deterrent threats and vary the characteristics of the deterrent threats, looking at how types of target, types of attack vector, and the behavior that you're trying to deter actually influences gameplay. I will say that it very nicely adds on to a pretty significant canon that speaks to the difficulty of actually modeling deterrence, period, and also modeling deterrence within gameplay. That has been really, really interesting to be a part of. Inside of our wargame environment, we've had to create a threat space and an action space, which has been kind of interesting and difficult to make sure that we're able to pull the data out that we need to answer these questions, but is also kind of exciting. And I think one of the nice things about Signal for the field was that it took the kind of the signaling and costly signaling literature that we know is important theoretically and demonstrates it in practice. In this work here, we're trying to push on this threat space and really get to grips with what these threats look like here as well. Of course, the obligatory slew of individuals that we owe. We stand on the shoulders of giants, and that's certainly true. From Peter Perla to Philip Sabin, Reed, Jackie, and Eric that I mentioned. Our own team, Brandon Green and Austin Long. So lots of work in this space that's terribly exciting and interesting to see, and hopefully influencing the way in which we do war games moving forward. So with that, I will leave you with a picture of our Signal board game and my email address, and really looking forward to the Q&A. Apologies, Ian, I went slightly over, but hopefully that's okay. And really looking forward to engaging with all of you. And I'll probably take my screen down just so that I can see you if you feel like coming off of video for the Q&A portion.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Dr. Reddie. And to everyone out in the audience, you can start throwing your questions in the chat there. And I've got a couple of things I was jotting down to kind of start things off. So you right at the outset, you mentioned that for some of, figuring out how capabilities can sort of impact social decisions and, human thinking, and not having the data to sort of make judgments on that. We get and are on board with using the war games to fill that gap, but so I guess the challenge that we've sometimes found, or kind of like to know how you cracked it, is you've described some metrics on how to capture the data, how do you get people to listen to the data once it's captured? And so I assume you have a research question you're asking. So whoever asked the question wants the answer, right?
Yep.
But how do you sort of convince them to internalize the answer or accept the answer based on the outcome of the game? Whether depending if there's some skepticism on using a game to generate that data.
So there's two answers to this question, and it's a good one. The first answer is that I think that given from my perspective, the nascent state of the field in terms of using war games for scholarly inquiry or social science inquiry, is using mixed methods is the only way to kind of square this circle. So in our work, we used a DGP that's fairly accepted inside of the IR literature, the survey experiment. And we validated off of that and spoke about where the wargaming data was different. And the survey experiment survey experiment data was different. And kind of took our readers through that process, but really benchmarking against accepted DGPs in the discipline is really important. So whatever your audience views as being the state of the art in the field, try to model the problem their way and then layer the wargame data on top. So if you have a customer who's very much in favor of formal models, right? What's the formal model answer to your problem set? How does your wargame data vary? Where does it point to important differences between the two? I mean, ultimately, the questions that we get asked, in my view, don't have a capital T truth answer. We have to spec our models somehow, whether they're wargame models or formal models or game theoretical models or computer-based models. They're all spec'd, right? So it's under these particular conditions, then this. And so that's my first answer. You're going to use mixed methods, in order to kind of drive towards a finding. And if you're able to triangulate a finding across multiple DGPs, you're in really good shape. If I get the same results from a survey experiment, same results for my Monte Carlos, and same results for my war games, I can be fairly sure that I'm seeing there's a there. I'm seeing what you'd expect. The other answer to your question will take a lot longer, which is that it involves doing the work of interrogating the laboratory effects to get over the hump of, well, it's just a game. How can that possibly show me anything? And in reality, I think it's almost like a branding problem, because sure, war games have problems. I think the most significant problem from my perspective is not that it's a game, but that it ends. The world does not end, right? It is iterative. It is not non-iterative. War games are non-iterative. That's the real problem with a war game methodologically, not that it's a game. And we should have a really open and frank discussion about, well, where is a war game useful versus a survey experiment useful? But I see a lot of problems with existing DGPs that are sometimes worse, I guess that's a normative statement, than the war game designs that sometimes object to on the basis of it's a game. Ultimately, compared to a survey experiment, instead of a wargaming environment, I've created the conditions under which strategic interaction takes place. That's really important. We know that's important to crises. I've created the conditions under which players have to live with their consequences of their actions. That's really important. And I've got a human involved. And last time I checked, crises are driven by humans. And we'll talk about worlds in which that may not be happening in the future, if you want. But I think that we need to do the work of really doing comparisons of these various data generating processes and being honest about where war games have their strengths and where war games have their weaknesses. Indeed, I mean, a big part of my analytical wargaming work, experimental wargaming work, addresses what were viewed as the weaknesses of the traditional wargaming toolkit, which is that you play a game once with one set of people, and then you say, this happened. It's not particularly compelling from an analytical perspective. How do I know that having somebody different in the room might have changed the gameplay? Having a different person in the white cell might have changed the gameplay. A different game design might have led to a radically different conclusion about what happens in a Baltic Sea escalation scenario. And so I think that's the longer term answer that we need to embark on as a field. Of course, if you're using war games for training and education, less of a problem, because there I'm really using a war game like I do with my students instead of reading shelling, I will like create the conditions under which you might actually want to deter, and you make deterrence real. Whoop, sorry, Siri is saying hi. But yeah, I think that longer term work needs to happen as well. But from my view, the data not mattering because it's a game is something of a cheap shot, because really the problem lies in the fact that the game environment doesn't last forever, rather than the fact that it's a game. And indeed, the fact that it's a game and you can control the win conditions as a lever, and you can control the ways in which players are actually engaging in competition, right, and making them more or less like the real world, like that's actually value. That's not a hindrance, in my view. Hopefully that got your questions there, Ian.
Yeah, no, it did. And it's the fact that the game ends, you only get one iteration is it's a challenge, because you don't want it to end, but you also don't have infinite time to give to it. So, when you kind of hit on it at the end, there's something else I wanted to look at, which this not really it's sort of a specific thing on what you mentioned, your students in class, doing a game instead of reading shelling. Like what deterrence is, what it means to people, how you successfully do it without turning it into a massive kinetic or nuclear exchange. That's a question that's on a lot of people's lips these days. So I'm curious, actually, and you mentioned the difficulty in modeling it, period, and then modeling it separately in Wargames. So what are you doing with your students to have them immerse them in a constructed environment where they're grappling with deterrence decisions? Like what game you're using, what level of complexity or what level of understanding are you expecting them to bring to the table, and how successful has it been?
Yeah, I mean, really, I still try to make them two different things. So the cyber deterrence work that I discussed is not education experience. That's analytical. So that's inside of the labs, where we're pushing on that. There, we're really interested in deterrence by punishment. We're trying to look at the conditions under which players are trying to manipulate your adversary's likelihood of doing something or not doing something that they would otherwise do. So very classical definition of deterrence. We don't dabble in deterrence by denial, etc. But in a classroom setting, I actually am trying to poke at the distinctions between various different types of deterrence, right? And whether, I want to try to have a discussion with my students about whether deterrence by denial is in fact deterrence, or whether it's just defense, or in some cases offense. But oftentimes for me, I'm a really big fan of the kind of back of the napkin scenarios. So one of the ones that I've just built out for my students in the last year actually uses P.W. Singer and August Cole's book, Ghost Fleet, which is probably, well known to everybody on this call, and actually trying to pull different parts of that out as the baseline scenario, and have them think about what are the different things that the United States posture might have looked like in order to deter in the book. I guess spoiler alert. Can I spoil the book for folks?
It's been around for a while. You're fine.
Yeah, in that particular book, it's a Chinese invasion of Hawaii scenario. So I kind of create a vignette on the basis of where that book manuscript lives up until about the end of the first third, and take my students through. Okay, here's your baseline posture for what the U.S. looked like more or less inside that scenario. What might have happened to change the way that the Chinese behaved? So signaling, so distribution of military capabilities, qualitatively different military capabilities, right? And you build the scenario that way. But that particular game is made for, a 2-hour session that attempts to try to make some of that literature real for them. And I think they actually start to understand what it is that deterrence is actually trying to achieve from doing it inside of a war game that you don't get when you're kind of stuck struggling through the literature. Which is not to say I don't assign it. I do. It's just that I think my general sense is that the students are saying, I like learning it via the war game. I don't like it by reading. But that's the back of the napkin. Of course, other there are commercial games out there. A lot of folks use Statecraft, for example, and so there's like add-ons you can do to that kind of thing inside the classroom. I tend to I guess by virtue of the fact that I get to do wargaming work for a living, I like to do my own. But in that case, I was really kind of inspired by their book and used that. So.
Yeah, great, thank you. And I just wrote Statecraft Alex. I'm gonna go look it up on Amazon, see what it costs. We got a question here from Travis Reese for you. Travis, you will ask your question directly.
Yeah, sure. Let me come off mute. So, I was kind of curious about why you've stipulated that only one iteration of play is available for you in the execution of the analysis, and why that's a limitation. Certainly, I'm cheating a little bit at solitaire. Ian's familiar with the game that I ran for the Marine Corps, where we did multiple iterations over 2 months. Game was distributed, and it was a day-to-day competition game below the threshold of armed conflict, and the express requirement for the players was that if you escalate, you actually fail. So the idea was turning this back in certain ways that would then cause a de-escalation event. Part of that then, to drive the analysis to see if that was feasible, was we had to actually give them multiple engagements where escalation was possible, and then see how that was driven down to see then if the results could be replicated with the capabilities of the forces we gave them. So based on that, I was wondering why you were conditioning that potentially as an absolute for the environment you're working with, as opposed to other iterations where we've done this where we haven't had the same problem.
Yeah, so to be clear, we do not run one iteration war games. The war games that you're seeing out of likes of Rand CNA are often one-shot war games, or at the very least, very low-end war games. So you're talking about like 5 to 10 playthroughs of this war game, and then a big report that says like this is what happened, right? Our team is very much interested in creating, it sounds like you, creating an environment that actually allows for repeat play and that allows for lots of plays such that we can actually get some semblance of the, well, we can start to engage with what the patterns of the gameplay actually look like across games, so that we are able to compare hundreds of games instead of ones, twos, fives. And indeed, that's what you need in order to actually say something meaningful about the outcomes from your game environment. It's not appropriate, in my view, to play a war game once and say X will happen in the Baltic Sea, Y will happen in the Black Sea. It is perfectly reasonable for that type of war game design that's played once or twice or 3 times to say, hey, these really smart people and experienced people that I have around the table seem to think that missile defense is really important in the Baltic Sea scenario, or that missile defense is not important in the Baltic Sea scenario. That's a perfectly reasonable finding from a traditional war game. It's not appropriate, in my view, on the basis of 5 gameplays to say you're always going to get escalation when X. And so I'm massively in favor, like you were, of having multiple iterations of gameplay. But what is the same for traditional war games, or we call traditional, it's a big bucket, and then analytical war games, is that the game ends. I mean, there's no way to get around that. I mean, we try to fiddle with that a little bit. We have kind of randomization around when a game ends for various designs. So we have, a randomizer that will end the game after round 4, 5, 6, or 7 for one of our games, in order to try to deal with that particular problem. But of course, it still ends at some point. But yeah, it's, we're ideally, if folks are interested in doing outcome-oriented inference, we want all war games to be performed multiple times in order to get a sense of where the game design might be actually tripping up the findings. And of course, in your case, that makes perfect sense, right? If you're having players play it for learning outcomes, they're going to be doing learning by virtue of playing the game multiple times. What I will say is the problem there, and one of the things that we did track inside of our data, was when players were repeat players. Because obviously, if they're more experienced with the game and they're matched up against players that are less experienced, that's going to have an impact on gameplay. And so you want to try to account for that. And so one of the variables that we track is if players that come across signal in various settings, how that repeat play might make some of the things that we were interested in around the use of particular nuclear capabilities or military capabilities higher or lower. So we track that. There's, of course, path dependence in all of this. how I played the game last time is going to impact the way that I played the game this time. And so that's important to bear in mind.
No, excellent. Thank you. Appreciate it.
No worries.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. And don't have any other questions for you in the chat. I do have just kind of maybe one final thing. If you have that Wargaming Cyber Deterrence in particular, that's another, the Wargaming Cyber and Wargaming Deterrence together are two kind of problem sets that we're certainly looking at Marine Corps University. We're not alone in that, but that Tantalus program that's under development, you said that was something that would be open and as a tool potentially. Where in the development process is that, and where could our community potentially expect it to hit the streets?
Yeah, it's so it's a 3-year funded project. So that's 2024 that we hope to have it complete. And yeah, the idea, I mean, obviously the ideal case is that we have an institution that creates the sandbox for all of us to play in. Of course, that sandbox, given the variety of game designs that exist, will have to be very, very expansive. But the dream is there. I mean, whether Castle, which is the name of that platform, is able to do that for all war games, I think the answer is likely to be no. But if it can do it for classes of war games, like say cyber war games or like say deterrence war games, that'll be really great. But I mean, obviously happy to chat with anybody who's interested on that kind of sandbox effort. I think that one of the things that, so I come to this field from an academic perspective rather than a practitioner perspective, which makes me a little bit interesting perhaps. But one of the things that I think that wargaming needs in order to be mainstreamed as an analytical tool is PhD candidates, postdoctoral fellows picking up the method and using it. And right now, the barriers to entry are significant, and it's very costly to engage in building a war game. So anything we can do, like creating sandboxes to drive that cost down, I'm all for it. I think I'm very heartened by Sebastian Bay's endeavor at Georgetown, the Wargaming Society there, the MIT Wargaming Working Group that Eric Lynn Greenberg started or is now supporting. Those are the people that are ultimately going to bring wargaming methods into the academy and help address, Ian, your first question, right? Which is, how do we get people to take wargaming stuff seriously, right? It's making sure that it has that academic backbone to support it. And so that sandbox effort is important. Of course, I think I can speak for myself and some of my colleagues. Efforts to create that sandbox, we are wildly supportive of. And like I said, hopefully we'll make a tool that's useful for the community moving forward.
Yeah, no, that's good to hear. Obviously everyone else wants someone else to do it first, and then they can all jump on. But
exactly.
Having anything, would be better than sort of the present state, which is we at the Krulak Center and maybe you and other folks in the academic wargaming world as well. We've been asked, kind of regularly, we need to wargame cyber more in the things that we do, and we don't have a lot of options to offer. So to even have a potential option coming down the road is good news, I think. Okay, great. Well, we're coming up on the hour, and got a hard stop we got to meet here. So Dr. Reddie, thanks for joining us today. Thanks to everyone in our audience for joining us, and hope you come back next week where our wargaming theme will continue, and we'll be joined by another one of our gaming non-resident fellows who you've also seen on that same panel before. You may also have seen in some faculty development here at Marine Corps University. Dr. James Pigeon Fielder will be back to talk about war game mechanics and game mechanics beyond war games. So we hope to see you all then. Thank you.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.